Rome, marble white under moonlight, perfumed with myrrh, coiled with whispers. The imperial palace gleams above the Palatine Hill, a crown of power forged in conquest, draped in silk and soaked in wine. But listen carefully. Beneath the fountains and flattery, something rots. A woman screams behind a gilded curtain. A senator weeps, barefoot and humiliated, crawling through the forum to kiss the feet of a god. And in the shadows, soldiers stand silent as a child is strangled, not for rebellion, but for bloodline. This is not the Rome of valor, not Cicero's republic, not Caesar's ambition. This is the Rome of Caligula, a Rome ruled not by law or legacy, but by impulse. They called him Divis Caligula, the little boot made divine. He was born in blood, raised in armor, hailed by the legions before he could speak. For a fleeting moment, the empire rejoiced. The heir of Germanicus, the golden boy of the Julio-Claudians, come to restore Rome's glory. But within months, the city choked on its own hope. Orgies in the Senate chamber, executions by whim. A horse, anointed as priest, sisters defiled, a treasury emptied on seashells. And in every dark hallway of the imperial court, fear, thick as incense. What illness twists a man into a monster? What empire bows to a god who cannot weep? And why did Rome, that great, brutal machine, keep applauding even as it bled? Today, we strip away the legend. We descend into the mind of Gaius Caligula, not to gawk at madness, but to understand the anatomy of tyranny. This is not a tale of decadence. It is a requiem for the death of mercy. The boots were too large for his feet, but the soldiers laughed anyway, not out of mockery, but reverence. They called him Caligula, little boot, the darling of the counts, a boy draped in miniature armor, cloaked in the scent of iron and sweat, marching beside the colossus of Roman conquest. His father, Germanicus, noble, golden, adored by the legions, smiled down at him with a warrior's pride and a father's gentleness. It was the last time Gaius would ever feel safe. They cheered for him in Germania, tossed bread, lifted him to their shoulders as if he were an omen of glory. His laughter rang over blood-soaked fields, where men died with his father's name on their lips. He did not understand then what war was. He only knew the warmth of leather grips, the rhythm of drums, the way the wind curled around banners crimson with honor. Then the wind changed. Germanicus returned to Rome in a coffin. The empire's brightest sun, poisoned far from home, buried, under a silence too deep to question. They said it was illness. They said it was fate. But Gaius saw his mother's hands shake when she touched the urn. He saw her smile collapse behind closed doors. Agrippina the elder, proud widow, loyal Ramong, began to speak too loudly in the marble halls. She named names. She accused shadows. She would not kneel. One by one, the empire took her sons. Nero gone. Drusus gone. Starved, strangled, silenced. Agrippina herself was dragged through the city by guards who did not meet her eyes. Her screams echoed through the Senate porticos like the wailing of furies. Gaius watched from a garden, silent, his small fingers clenched around a wax doll. By the time he reached his teenage years, Rome had devoured his family whole. They sent him to live with Tiberius. The palace on Capri was not built for children. It was carved into cliffs, where sea winds howled through corridors, and the walls smelled of salt and old blood. The emperor did not smile. He watched. He measured. And Gaius, small, orphaned, clever, learned to survive. He learned to hold back tears when eunuchs beat disobedient slaves. He learned to praise the monsters who whispered lies and then disappeared. He learned how to be invisible when men screamed behind locked doors. To live, he became a mirror. Tiberius loved loyalty. Gaius gave him worship. He bowed, obeyed, smiled. Inside, he locked his grief in silence. The boy who once wore little boots now walked barefoot through marble halls, slick with secrets. He slept beside knives and woke to dreams of drowning. He forgot the sound of his mother's voice. He forgot the taste of his brothers' names, but he remembered the crowd, the way they looked at him in the camps, the way they cheered, the way they needed him. And in the darkness of Capri, Gaius began to whisper to himself, not as a boy, not as a servant, not as prey, but as the heir, the living blood of Augustus, the son of Germanicus, the golden thread of a dying republic's. Last illusion, no one saw him growing. They saw only the smile. The perfect, tragic smile of a broken boy pretending to be whole. When the emperor finally died, the people rejoiced. But they did not know what they had inherited. Gaius stepped into the light, cloaked in charm and the scent of myrrh. And Rome, desperate for salvation, opened its arms. They crowned him with laurel. They called him divine. They called him hope. They did not yet know they were feeding their last dream to a god who had learned to smile through silence. And something in him, soft, terrified, unfinished, remained behind, curled like a child's hand around a ghost that would never speak again. The air smelled of rose oil and roasted lamb. Garlands hung from balconies, their petals bruised under the weight of too many hands. Rome exhaled for the first time in years and called it peace. Tiberius was dead, his body pale and bloated. From age and secrets lay stiff as marble beneath a sheet of purple, and the people did not weep. They whispered blessings to the gods, laughed in taverns, tossed coins into fountains, not as prayers, but as exorcisms. The monster had died, and in his place rose a sunlit promise, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Caligula, the boy they remembered, the child of the legions, the living heir of Germanicus, kissed by Mars and Mercury, too perfect to corrupt. He rode through the city like a dream dressed in ivory. The crowds pressed forward, breathless, hysterical, to touch the hem of his robes. Women cried. Veterans saluted with trembling fists. Even senators bowed without being asked. For 6 months, mercy reigned. Prisoners were released, exiles restored, taxes forgiven. Festivals multiplied like wildflowers in spring. The circus roared with new blood and brighter banners. Bread fell from balconies. Statues of Caligula rose. Overnight, smiling, radiant, crowned with laurels that had not yet wilted. He spoke softly. He thanked the gods. He kissed babies. And behind every gesture, the empire watched with stunned gratitude, forgetting. Momentarily, the shape of cruelty, but mercy, like a mask, is thin. One evening, the lamps in the palace burned longer than usual. Courtiers passed through the halls with tight lips and sleepless eyes. The city held its breath. Rumors slipped through the cracks like smoke. Caligula had collapsed. Fever, convulsions, a wasting illness that darkened the whites of his eyes and twisted his limbs until even his voice trembled. For weeks, the capital descended into candlelit prayer. Men lit incense in the temples of Jupiter, of Augustus, of Caligula himself. Senators wept in public. Mothers tore their veils. Even the air seemed to shiver with fear, not for the man, but for what might return if he died. And then he rose, thinner, paler, quieter. He looked in the mirror and did not recognize the eyes staring back. Something inside had shifted, not snapped, but melted. He no longer smiled. His hands lingered too long on wine goblets, trembled too easily at touch. When he walked, it was as if the ground no longer obeyed him. They rejoiced again, but quieter. This time, the cheers faded faster. The flowers drooped before sunset. Something had been taken from him. Or perhaps something had awakened. He stared longer at the statues of gods. He demanded silence when he passed. He began to ask questions no one understood, about divinity, about eternity, about whether the stars obeyed him or mocked him. And those who had once been closest began to keep their distance. Like priests before a burning altar, the boy of promise had returned, but not entirely. Behind the mercy, behind the soft robes and public grace, there was a flicker of something. Hollow. Something watching. The laughter stopped echoing in the forum. And though the Empire had begged for his recovery, it now realized, too late, that it had prayed for the return of a face, not knowing what soul might come with it. False hope is the cruelest mercy, because when it fades, you remember that you were willing to believe. And that is how monsters are welcomed. Not with fear, but with gratitude. The marble floors had grown colder, not by season, not by weather, but by presence, as if something ancient and unspeakable had begun to coil beneath the surface of Rome's palaces, curling upward like frost beneath a door. Even sunlight seemed to pause before crossing the threshold. Servants began to whisper prayers, not to the gods of Olympus, but to the man sitting on the throne. He no longer answered to princeps, not emperor, not Caesar. He called himself a god. At first, they laughed, nervously, quietly, as one laughs at a child who believes himself immortal, or a drunk who mistakes his shadow for a ghost. But the laughter faded when altars were raised in his name. When incense burned for Gaius, son of Jupiter, light of the world, lord of the earth and sea, he had a temple built where his statue stood beside Venus, Apollo, Mars, but slightly taller, slightly closer to the light. When priests hesitated, he fed them their hesitation in silence. When senators faltered, he knelt before his own reflection and commanded them to worship. And they did, one by one. The most powerful men in the world dropped to their knees before a mirror. Their lips touched the feet of golden effigies. Their voices cracked as they blessed the name of Caligula, Savior, Thunderbolt, Divine Flame. They did not believe. But belief was no longer required. Only silence, only obedience, only the ritual of surrender, performed with clean robes and lowered eyes. He had the head of Jupiter's statue removed, the god of gods dethroned, decapitated, and replaced with his own. The sculptor's hands trembled as he carved the new likeness. Too sharp a nose, and he might vanish. Too flat a brow, and his name might disappear by nightfall. Every hammer stroke was a prayer for survival. Behind the walls, the man they called. Divine filled the hours with performance. He would summon nobles and force them to watch as he mocked their dead fathers. He made generals dress as women, priests bark like dogs, senators dance naked in chains, not in passion, but in punishment. They played along, swallowing their names like seeds, letting their shame ferment in silence. In the banquet halls, the scent of perfume mixed with burning flesh. He delighted in cruelty, not as punishment, but as theater. He watched men beaten for spilling wine, laughed as lovers were tortured for glancing at each other, whispered to a girl moments before her execution, "You are dying for the moon." The words meant nothing. That was the point. Meaning had been torn from the world, like flesh from a beast. He ordered the treasury to fund new temples, not to gods, but to himself. Coins bore his face with radiating halos. His image was etched into goblets, sewn into curtains, cast in bronze, and hung in brothels. Mirrors in the palace were draped, not out of modesty, but because no reflection could be permitted but his. And in the night, when the fires died down and the palace cooled, he wandered the halls speaking to his own echo. He spoke to the stars, as though they answered. He wept in front of statues. He demanded that thunder pause when he spoke. And sometimes, when he believed himself alone, he looked at his own hands with wonder, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be mortal. The city no longer moved with rhythm, but with fear. Every word carried weight. Every silence was a risk. Even the sky above Rome, once praised as eternal, seemed to bow lower each day, afraid of offending him. Godhood had not elevated him. It had devoured him, and those around him, the priests, the senators, the slaves, followed him not into worship, but into a void where cruelty wore a crown and mercy was treason. Not because they believed, but because no one survives the madness of a god, especially when the god still remembers being a boy. There was a day when the cobblestones trembled, not from earthquake or thunder, but from hooves. A chariot, gilded and grotesque, barreling through the forum like a god's tantrum given form. Beside it, men in togas, senators, consuls, veterans of law and war, ran panting and sweating, stripped of dignity, their purple hems dragging in dust and excrement. He called it sport. Their knees bled. Their sandals snapped. Still they ran, not one dared stop. The palace had become a stage, the court, a playhouse of dread. And Caligula, no longer content with mere obedience, began scripting scenes of pain with the precision of a poet. He turned every chamber into a theater of shame, where fear performed in costume and cruelty wore cologne. The dinners were silent massacres, lavish, decadent feasts where roast peacocks steamed beside severed hands. Pearls dissolved in vinegar poured into goblets of gold. Senators would toast with hollow smiles, praying they weren't seated too close. For at any moment, without reason, without cause, he might turn to a guest and say, "You die." And the guards would remove them, quietly, professionally. As if clearing an empty plate, no crimes were named, no accusations made, just a glance, a nod, a removal, then laughter. He laughed more now, a brittle, barking sound that scratched the walls. He surrounded himself with musicians who could not play, actors who could not speak, dancers who moved like marionettes in nightmares. When guests asked if the music was beautiful, they were asked to repeat it, louder, until they believed it. Cruelty was no longer hidden in Rome. It paraded. There were rumors of the Colonia audience, an entire amphitheater sentenced to death because their applause was not enthusiastic enough. Men, women, and children swept into the arena and slaughtered to fill the silence. He watched from above, face lit by torchlight, chewing pomegranate seeds as if enjoying a play whose ending he already knew. The executioners worked slowly, their blades wet and warm, the air filled with the scent of blood and perfume. And when it was done, he yawned, not out of remorse, out of boredom. He began rehearsing his own assassinations aloud. He would describe in detail how he might kill each senator, outlining the method, the tools, the time of day. He said it as one might describe a garden or a sculpture, coldly, casually. The men laughed too loudly, too long, pretending it was all jest, but jest, under Caligula, had become indistinguishable from judgment. Prisoners were no longer just condemned. They were displayed, paraded, used as living ornaments for his games. He once ordered a thief sewn into the skin of a recently killed lion, left to die in the sun. A punishment not for theft, but for displeasing his mood. No one asked why. As months bled into each other, silence became survival. Guards began to execute orders before they were spoken. Slaves began to walk without footsteps. Even the wind through the colonnades seemed to whisper softer. Names disappeared from rolls. Faces vanished from memory. Those who lived did so by erasing themselves. The palace smelled always of myrrh and meat, and beneath the laughter, beneath the silk and gold, there was the constant pulse of fear, hot, metallic, thick in the throat like swallowed nails Rome. Once a republic of laws and legend, had become a circus of suffering, and the audience, whether in chains or seated on marble thrones, could not leave. They could only clap, scream, or fall silent, depending on what pleased the man behind the mask that day. In the empire of Caligula, cruelty was not a consequence, it was the show. And Rome, proud, ancient, eternal Rome, had forgotten how to say no. The silk was white when it touched the floor, white like the linens of a virgin bride, white like the bone beneath a clean wound. But when she stood from the couch, her back to the court, the fabric clung to her like accusation. Not one voice in the room dared to breathe. Drusilla had entered the chamber as sister. She left it as something else. He did not announce it. He did not need to. He stood beside her, his gaze like flame pressed to wet cloth, and whispered words no brother should know. He walked with her hand in his, not at her side, but behind her, as if to present his possession to the world. She did not smile. She did not resist. No one asked if she consented. Consent was a sound no longer spoken in Rome. She shared his meals, his bed, his chambers. When guests arrived, she sat where an empress would sit, and though she wore no crown, the perfume on her skin smelled of power, jasmine, and something darker beneath. He called her his Venus reborn, but his touch betrayed divinity for desire. The walls watched. The marble held its tongue. His other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, were summoned like ornaments, dressed in veils that concealed nothing, paraded through the courts like sacrificial lambs, their eyes dark with understanding. He touched their hair too often, laughed too long when they flinched. They had learned by now, silence is the last protection before disappearance. He flew into rages when other men looked too long. He exiled those who spoke her name with admiration. He ordered one lover torn apart by dogs, not because he loved her, but because he couldn't share her. It was not lust, not love, it was ownership. Soaked in memory, a twisted hunger shaped in the dark corridors of Capri, where affection had always arrived wrapped in blood. When Drusilla grew ill, he summoned healers from across the empire. When they failed, he threatened to make God's answer for her suffering. She died anyway, quietly, beneath woven blankets. Her eyes turned to the ceiling like someone who had already rehearsed the end. Rome fell into an unnatural stillness. The bells did not ring. The birds did not sing. Even the wind held its breath. He did not weep as a brother. He howled as a widower. He beat his chest raw until his hands bled, screamed until his throat collapsed, and ordered the Senate to declare her divine. Temples were built. Coins were struck. Statues were carved with features soft as grief. He renamed the stars after her. He renamed months in her honor. He forced the empire to mourn what it dared not name. For 40 days, laughter was outlawed. The prisons filled with anyone who questioned. Why? And though the people had long learned the rituals of obedience, this morning tasted different, heavier, colder, as if even the gods were confused. Her image lingered on every wall, but no one spoke her name aloud. Not even her sisters. She had become a saint by decree, a goddess by grief, a symbol carved from the corpse of a girl who once held a doll in the gardens of Capri and whispered to herself that someday it would be over, but it never ended, because in Rome, when the gods break, it is not thunder that follows. It is silence, and silence, once chosen, becomes ritual, and ritual becomes erasure. The wind along the shore carried no scent of war, only salt and kelp, and the soft whisper of gulls circling above sand, too pale for blood. Yet the legions stood in full armor, silent, rigid, glinting with sweat beneath a sun that offered no shade. Their shields were polished, their spears perfectly aligned. They waited not for an enemy, but for a command they already feared to understand. Caligula approached the waves with arms outstretched, not in blessing, in conquest. His voice, sharp and thin against the ocean's breath, declared war on Neptune. No jest, no metaphor. He ordered catapults rolled forward, arrows loosed into empty surf. swords raised to the tide as if Poseidon himself might rise foaming from the deep. The sea did not retaliate, but the silence of its indifference made it worse. And when no blood could be spilled, he demanded trophies. The soldiers, veterans of Germania, men who had killed and watched brothers die, were commanded to fill their helmets with seashells. Not one dared disobey. They marched down into the froth, bent their knees into salt water, and gathered the curved bones of dead mollusks as if looting a conquered city. He called it triumph, declared himself victorious over the gods, issued a formal report to the Senate, detailing the spoils, celebrated with parades and banquets. Rome laughed, briefly, then the laughter turned inward, curled into the gut like sickness. Because he kept spending? Chariots of gold, stables paved in marble, gladiator games that devoured the treasury like wildfire through wheat, entire villas gifted to actors for a single jest, temples raised not to honor the divine, but to house statues of himself in different poses, smiling, weeping, crowned, naked, and then the horse, incitatus, fed with gilded oats, draped in purple silk, a stall lined with ivory, guarded by soldiers who whispered oaths into the straw. Caligula appointed him priest of Rome, spoke of naming him consul, left scrolls, open at the Senate doors bearing the seal of his hoof. At first, Rome tried to explain it, to say it was satire, irony, some performance only a genius could understand, but the explanations frayed. And beneath them, the truth began to show its teeth. He wasn't mocking the state, he was replacing it, one absurdity at a time. He was grinding Rome's identity into dust, not with cruelty alone, but with ridicule, turning its symbols into toys, its rituals into games, its power into performance. And no one could stop him, because to protest meant to admit the absurdity was real. So, they laughed, quietly, then nervously, then not at all, and in that silence, dread bloomed like mold beneath silk, because absurdity, under absolute rule, is not harmless. It is erosion of truth, of memory, of what people believe they're allowed to say. And when men begin gathering, shells under the banner of empire, it is no longer madness. It is a mirror, held to a dying world, reflecting how much they'll obey, and still pretend to believe. The corridor was narrow, colder than the rest of the palace. A stillness lived there, not peace, not calm, but the quiet that lingers before a scream. The stone walls held no echoes. The torches burned low, their flames trembling like secrets. About to escape, he entered without suspicion, the fabric of his cloak dragged gently across the floor, soft as silk over a grave. His boots struck with rhythm, unhurried, surrounded by those who bowed but did not breathe. There were no fanfares today, no golden procession, no crowds to drink his image. Just whispers behind doors and footsteps that did not belong to him. And one man who had made up his mind, Cassius Chaerea, had been humiliated too many times, mocked for his voice, slapped in jest, called names once whispered only in brothels. His dignity peeled away day by day beneath the laughing gaze of a god who had forgotten what it meant to be merely human. He gripped the dagger inside his robe, as if it were the last part of himself that still remembered how to feel shame. The plan had no poetry, just opportunity, the Palatine games, noise, distraction, spectacle. The guards rotated, the crowds distracted, the emperor vulnerable, the emperor mortal. He waited for the signal. There was none. There didn't need to be. Caligula turned toward. A shadow he did not recognize. His mouth opened, not to speak, to command, but the blade moved faster than the words. Into the neck, the ribs, the belly, over and over again, until blood covered the marble in spattered arcs. It did not flow like in battle. It pulsed, Red, thick, intimate, they say he cried out only once, not in fear, not in pain, in disbelief, as if even in death he could not imagine. The world without his permission. By the time the other blades joined in, he was already crumpling, not falling, unraveling. The folds of his robe soaked crimson, his limbs twisted like roots torn from earth. The mask of godhood peeled from his face, and underneath it, only a man, a thin, broken man who had once worn little boots, 30. Wounds, some shallow, some not. He died with a corridor bent toward the servant's wing, a place he rarely walked, a place where names were not spoken aloud, where people survived by being invisible, and still no one celebrated. Word spread. Like smoke, first the slaves heard it, then the scribes, then the generals, then the Senate. And everywhere it reached, mouths opened, but no cheers came. Just silence, wide, aching silence, as if the city had lost something it could not name, and wasn't sure whether to mourn or to breathe. Some wept, some laughed, some locked their doors, but no one felt clean, because even in death he had stained them. Their tongues still bore his name. Their backs still remembered the weight of kneeling. And now, without him, the palace was not restored. It was hollow. They carried his body wrapped in cloth, not as a ruler, but as a warning. And for a moment, Rome stood still in the golden dust of the Forum, staring at nothing. They had killed a tyrant. But the mirror he held up, the mirror that showed them what fear could make them do, what silence could make them become. The mirror did not shatter. It remained, and in its reflection, they saw not justice, only themselves. They scraped his name from stone, chiseled it from arches, burned it from scrolls, melted the bronze that bore his face, and scattered the ashes into the Tiber. His statues were pulled down in the dark, carted away before sunrise, so that the city might pretend he had never been. But the bloodstains didn't vanish. The corridors still remembered his footsteps. The walls still carried the echo of a god who had once demanded silence and received it. He was dead, yes, but not gone. The Senate met with straight backs and lowered voices, trying not to tremble. As they restored order, they spoke of balance, of reason, of Rome's return to virtue. But every word they used had once been spoken in his praise. Every robe they wore had once been kissed in his name. The cult he built did not crumble. It shifted. They had called him divine. Now they called him madness. But the throne he poisoned remained untouched, only reupholstered in softer fabric. The rituals continued. The incense still burned. The people still bowed. They just bowed to someone else. They buried his memory like a dog, quick, shallow, afraid it might return. But the shape he carved into the empire's spine never healed, because it was never just him. It was the hunger he fed, the theater he perfected, the spectacle that made obedience feel sacred and cruelty seem like law. It was the mirror he held up and forced Rome to look into, to see what it could become when truth bent to power and power, dressed in robes of light. He had shown them how easily a city of law could become a stage, how loyalty could be extracted not with love, but with spectacle, how a name, repeated long enough, could become holy or cursed and still be obeyed. And in the years that followed, they would speak of other emperors, other gods, other horrors, but always somewhere beneath their breath, his name waited, not spoken, felt like a draft in a sealed room, a shadow beneath a closed door, a sickness that had passed, but left the body weaker. They had killed the tyrant, but the altar remained, and the empire kept praying, even when no one was sure who was listening anymore.